This is Capital Views, and I'm Mike Bradner, and we're here with Clive Thomas, a retired university professor from our own university in Juneau, and he's completed a rather voluminous book. And Clive, what's one of your more interesting chapters, or what enthused you?
Well, there are several chapters that I'm interested in, but I think one that might be of interest to the audience is a chapter on political culture. Political culture, the sort of values that people have about politics, how they view government, how they view the role of government, and so on. And this is a very extensive chapter, and it takes on many of the what we might call myths or misunderstandings that people have about Alaska. And I would say that the theme of the chapter is built around something which sounds quite contradictory, Mike. It's built around the theme of pragmatic, dependent individualism. And let's break that down.
Wow, that is that is a mouthful.
Yeah, pragmatic meaning people do things not necessarily according to ideology, but for the goal they have. Independent meaning, Alaskans like to think that they're independent in that regard. And the dependent meaning, in fact, Alaska is a very dependent state. It's very much dependent on the federal government. It's dependent upon the oil industry and so on, And so what we do, this is a co-authored chapter with a good friend of mine who's an expert on political culture. I'm not an expert on it, but I know a fair bit about Alaska political culture, of course, having taught it for 30 years. And what we try to do is we look at some of the things. Let me just take three very briefly. One is Alaska still a colony? A lot of people think Alaska's a colony of the lower 48, a victim of the federal government, all these sorts of things. Well, if we look at what colonies used to be, they were places that were controlled politically and economically by a country like Britain that controlled India, or France who controlled a lot of North Africa, and so on. People didn't have a vote, and so on. Alaska is certainly not a colony in that sense. Alaska has one of the higher standard of living in the world, and it also has, a very has its own natural resources. Obviously, very many of them. A lot of people think Alaska is a victim of the federal government, and certainly, of course, most recently with Obama's declarations on AMWAR and on the Chukchi Sea and so on.
That's been sort of a constant.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's a constant.
Right back to statehood.
People go back on that, but basically, when you think that Alaska gets 3 times as much per capita for its roads, when you think that we get a lot more money for many other programs and so on, it's a trade-off. Life's a trade-off, politics is a compromise, and so on. So we try to dispel that Alaska is a colony. Are Alaskans independent? Well, they like to think they are, but they're very dependent. They're very dependent upon government. They're very dependent upon the federal government, and they're also, we don't pay any state income tax. We don't pay any state sales tax. So this is the contradiction, the sort of belief in individualism, but the dependence thing. So that's part of that. Then we look at some other aspects about political culture in terms of the strength of political parties versus the strength of parties back in the Northeast and that sort of thing, or the Midwest, basically Alaskans, I think, are very pragmatic in the way that they approach politics. Obviously, we're a right of center state. We're obviously a red state, now completely red, of course, when you talk about Congress, and of course the House and the Senate. But with the Governor Walker being a nonpartisan, sort of independent, who got elected largely by the Democrats and Labor, of course, then it might come to the middle of the road. It's hard to say because you've got the whole thing with the oil. But so we try to do that. So that's the thing that we do there, and then we look at. Alaska in some ways is liberal. We have no death penalty. There are only 12 states that have no death penalty. And actually, some people may remember welfare reform from the old Clinton days, we actually have a longer period of paying people than most states do. So it's kind of an interesting, Alaska's a very interesting and complicated mix. And it's not at all like Washington.
What we fantasize we are.
We all
is not necessarily what we are.
Yeah, no, we are not.
But in politics, what you think you are is often, you make it the case.
Yeah, right, sure, yeah. And of course, we all want our cake and eat it, and today's privileges are tomorrow's demands. So, we don't want to start paying income tax. We don't want to we have our permanent fund reduced. So,
Well, that's sort of boilerplate. And
Yeah, right,
somebody
yeah.
Says, do you want to pay a tax? What's the
Well,
answer?
nobody does, yeah,
Nobody
right.
wants to do it. So,
yeah.
so our current sort of escalation of animosity with the federal government is,
Yeah.
I mean, was that sort of like status quo until the most recent actions?
Yeah,
by-
I mean, we have these things all the time. They come and they go. I guess ANWR, every governor has been supported the opening of ANWR, including Democratic governors. But the federal government owns that land. Not to get into too much detail, but the late Governor Hickel, used to talk about the federal government breaking their compact with Alaska. Well, remember, 1959 was a long time ago, before the rise of the environmental movement, and the federal government in 1959 is a lot different from the federal government in 2014. They have a lot of pressures on themselves too. I mean, they're not out to get Alaska, but
Well, I
it
would
seems that way.
assume many statehood acts have
Yeah.
been amended.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And, the stress is on the word act.
Yeah.
And even though we'd like to speak of it as a compact.
Yeah, and it changes, it's a dynamic thing. I mean, it's like, one of my particular hobby horses is, let's get back to what the founding fathers thought. Well, one, we can't figure that out, despite what people say. People have spent years writing on it, and there's no definitive thing. And plus, why would we want to go back to what, with 3.5 million people, 500,000 slaves, 13 colonists? I mean, why would you want to go back to that? I mean, really, it's rather. It sounds good, but pinning it down politics is dynamic. You know that.
Clive, we're out of time
Okay.
again, and it's been interesting talking to you. And this is Capital Views, and I'm Mike Bradner.